What is the difference between documentary sound and narrative sound from the perspective of the sound mixer? Today I want to talk about this topic and dive into some ideas about how you approach documentary sound and how you approach narrative sound. They're similar but very different, and today we're going to talk about it. I'm going to start out with a bunch of things that are the same or extremely similar. The one thing that is true across all areas of sound production as well as video production in general is that pre-production and planning is paramount. No matter whether or not you're doing documentary or narrative, you need to make sure that you have a good idea of what you're doing before you get there. You pre-plan, you bring the right equipment, you charge the batteries, you talk to the client, you read the script, you read the outline, you plan. So both approaches, documentary and narrative, require proper planning for success. Also, in general, microphone technique is similar. Microphones don't just start behaving differently because it's a documentary versus a narrative. You still have to get the microphone close, and you still have to get the microphone free of as much background and outside noise as possible. This is true in both settings. And you still have to work together with the director to figure out where the mic can be. Does it have to be hidden, or can it be visible? Do we want a boom? Do we want a handheld? So on and so forth. So the idea that microphones suddenly behave differently when you're doing narrative versus documentary, well, that's not true. Microphones behave about the same, and you just need to figure out how to get them as close as you can. The next thing that you really have to make sure you do on both types of jobs is you have to plan your wireless properly. You have to understand the wireless spectrum that is in the area. You have to use tools like wireless scanners. You have to figure out the wireless roadmap. And it's no different, regardless of narrative or documentary. You still have to find clean channels, and you still have to plan appropriately for everything to work the way it should. Lastly, the one thing that's the same, and I say this a lot in my videos, is that you have to be easy to work with. It doesn't matter the type of project that you're on. You have to be easy to work with. You have to be easy to work with. You have to be fun to talk to. You have to have a good attitude. You have to bring your best effort. You have to be a really good crew person. Okay, it doesn't matter the type of job that you're on. You need to bring your attitude that's positive. Right? And if you can't bring a positive attitude, then figure out how to change it. Right? If you notice you're on set and you're tanking a little bit and your attitude is going south, well, be good at recognizing that and turning it back up. Now we're going to get into some differences. Now in narrative sound, you have these things called scripts. Sometimes you have a script in a documentary. Sometimes you don't. Most of the documentaries I've worked on, I'm speaking from my experience, do not have a script. They might have an outline or some sort of structure, shot list of sorts, but that does not compare to the amount of detail that is in a narrative script. So that is the one thing that I want to say first here, is that you definitely have a script in narrative. You don't really have one in documentary. How does that impact the sound person? Well, for narrative, when you get that script, as the sound person, you need to read the script. Now, I know sometimes the sound person doesn't get a script in advance, but if you do get a script, you need to read it. And then when you get it, because you will eventually get one on set, hopefully, you need to read it. It is a roadmap. It helps you understand how many actors, what's the setting, what's the situation, and then you have more detail, okay? In a documentary, you don't have as much detail, and you're a little more flexible in the approach. You also have this thing in narrative called takes, okay? Takes are not a thing in documentary as much. Now, some documentaries use this in some basic forms, but not like a narrative. A narrative has a take, and they have a scene number. Sometimes they have a sub-scene number. They have a very detailed system for which they shoot all of the content, okay? And it's based on takes. How does this impact the sound person? Well, in the sound person's land, you need to be rolling on all of those takes. What does that mean? That means that when they say cut, you stop your recording. When they say roll audio, you start recording. So in the narrative sense, you are recording a lot more files. At the end of a day on a narrative shoot, I might have 100 files because we did 100 takes. There is a new audio file for every single take. In documentary, there are not nearly as many audio files that you record because normally you record longer takes. You record for a couple hours sometimes, okay? Why do you record for a couple of hours sometimes on a documentary? Well, because you don't know what's going to happen. If you go to a setting and you're following a person and they're doing things and they're there for an hour, my opinion is that as the sound person, you are responsible for making sure that everything this person says or could say is recorded. It is a failure when that key actor or subject in a documentary says something and you don't get it, okay? So in the documentary world, longer takes. At the end of a day, I might have 2 or 3 2-hour takes on a documentary. And on a narrative, I might have 100. So that's also a difference. The other difference is that in a narrative, you are almost always responsible for bringing that slate. Now, you should bring your slate to a documentary shoot, but in a narrative shoot, the slate turns into a very important thing that the second AC or the third AC, one of the assistant cameras usually will handle the slate. You have to bring it, but then they manage it. And though that slate is going in front of the camera every single time on a good narrative shoot. Now, sometimes narrative shoots, if they're low budget or not planned accordingly, sometimes that slate doesn't have the rigor. But normally on a narrative shoot, the slate is extremely important and it's always in there. And it is your job as the sound person to make sure sound is rolling before they clap that slate, okay? In a documentary sense, yeah, I've seen slates being used, and it's typically used in the setting of an interview where you would bring out the slate and you'd write the person's name on it and then clap it before you do an interview. But there's no clapping the slate before every take, every time that the camera operator is hitting record and stop. Like there's none of that. Time code is of utmost importance, okay? In documentary or narrative. I would argue that time code is more important in documentary because in documentary things get a little more chaotic and messy and cameras go all over the place. You might be on a shoot where there's 2 or 3 cameras and those cameras are all over the place and you are not right next to them and you don't know when they're hitting record and stop and you lose track a little bit of what's happening. And time code is of utmost importance on a documentary. If you are not time coding cameras on a documentary, that is a major problem because you need to be doing that. On a narrative, you also need to be time coding the cameras. I would argue it's less important. Yes, you do it because we do it, but I would say from an editor's perspective, slightly less important. Just my opinion. That might be a controversial take. Also, on a narrative, you have access to actors in a different way than you have access to subjects in a documentary. I've been in a documentary shoot where we're supposed to be interviewing somebody and literally they are going to walk in and sit down. They're going to walk in from some other place. We have 20 minutes with them. They're going to walk in and sit down and the interview is going to start within 1 minute of them hitting that chair. So you have 1 minute of access sometimes to the subject of a documentary or less. And you better be ready to go. You better be confident in your boom mic that that thing is going to land right where that person's head is, okay? In a narrative sense, you have typically more access to the actors. You can get to them ahead of time. You can talk to the wardrobe person. You can work on some more creative placement of microphones. You usually have more time in a narrative to get that microphone on them and in their costume the right way, okay? Sometimes in documentary, you have 1 minute or less. And you have, if you're gonna put a lav on somebody, like we're talking 1 minute or less, so you better have that thing ready to go. Then you can pop it on them, clip it on them, be confident and ready to go. Okay, so that's another difference, okay? Access to actors is a completely different world in narrative versus documentary. The other thing is that in a narrative, you tend to run into more controlled spaces. So what does that mean? It means that typically, not always, but typically, you have more control of the space in a narrative. Meaning you can make it quieter, you can turn off fans, you can turn off boilers if possible, you can minimize certain sounds, right? You can wait for the siren to go by, you can wait for the helicopter to go overhead. I've been on lots of documentaries where they don't wait for that stuff, okay? A siren goes by, it goes by, okay? A fan is on and we can't figure out how to turn it off, like the director's like, we don't have any time, let's go, okay? A motorcycle drives by. Sometimes that happens, right? On a documentary, your goal is to get the clean sound and your goal is to make sure the director knows, hey, like that motorcycle went by right at the wrong time when our subject was saying something really important. That's really good feedback to give to the director. On a narrative, there's normally time for another take, normally, because they're scripted lines, and there's normally time for another take, unless the director is pretty touchy and doesn't want to do another take. In a documentary, a lot of times you don't have time for another take, okay? Like, the person was crying and getting emotional and saying something, and it happened the way it happened. You can ask them to say it again, and I've seen that happen, but normally you don't, okay? The art of the interview is something that is prevalent in documentaries and obviously not applicable to narratives. The art of the interview, the art of good interview sound is applicable to the art of good dialogue sound and narrative, but in interview sound in documentaries, a lot of times you have to roll for 20, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, for a long interview. And that's a little different, in my opinion, than rolling 2 minutes of dialogue for a narrative. So how does that play out? Well, in a documentary, when you're doing a long-form interview, like, you better have it ready. You better have your batteries charged. You better have your batteries charged in your lav, your batteries ready in your mixer. You better have done your homework, run your lines, tested your mics, because when that interview starts, like, it's on. And it's not going to stop until it stops. Now, occasionally interruptions happen that are out of your control. Occasionally doors open and things happen. And that would be your time to change something. But generally speaking, especially in a high stakes environment for a documentary shoot, like, it's not cool to all of a sudden say, you know what, my mic wasn't recording for the last 10 minutes. Like, that's not cool, okay? So I would argue the stakes are a little higher on a documentary. No retakes. Now, some would argue you can do retakes on documentary. I know you can. I'm just saying in general, it's real life and there's no retakes. Another difference is cameras. A lot of the narratives I've been on have single camera approach. And that just means that they have one camera that they move all around and they shoot what we call coverage. Coverage just means that if there's a conversation at this table between two people or three people, whatever it is, the narrative approach, when you have a multicam, look, meaning when the final video is going to look like there was multiple cameras around, Most of the time, in my experience so far, especially in indie films, there's one camera and they shoot it coverage style. So they will shoot the same conversation, let's say 4 times. And they will isolate on each person for each time that they do it. So you have 3 people at the table, that's 3 takes to isolate on their coverage, so each person gets covered, and then there's probably a wide shot. This does not happen on documentaries. Sometimes there's a version of it. Most of the times there's not. So if, for example, you put 3 people at this table for a documentary, there's not going to be 3 times to get it. Or 4 times, rather. It's going to be 1, maybe 2. Maybe. Okay? So you better have your microphones on the people, and then you better be ready for multi-camera approach, meaning if that was a situation in a documentary, usually you'll have 2 to 3 cameras that are going to be covering the discussion simultaneously. Okay? That's where time code is extremely important. That's where getting it right on the first take is extremely important. When they shoot it coverage style for narrative, well, and you maybe miss your mic cue on somebody that's sitting at the table, you can, as an audio person, say, you know what, I need that one more time. Okay. Now, you always need to read the room. It's very important on narrative and documentary to read the room and say, all right, should I ask for it? Or is this going to really upset the director? Or should I ask for that take again because, that was an emotional scene and the actor had to cry and really pull some feeling out, right? Like, it's possible the director doesn't want him to do it again, but, read the room, okay? Always read the room. And then I want to talk about mixing versus tracking. I'm going to do a whole video on this and expand it a little more, but mixing versus tracking. A lot of times on a documentary, especially with multiple mic sources, like let's say there's 3 wireless and a boom. Normally, that is a tracking environment, which just means my job as the sound recordist is to take those 4 sound sources and track them into my mixer. I'm not mixing a final output. I'm tracking them. That's the word that we use. You're recording everything on isolated tracks. In narrative, sometimes they ask you to mix. Not all the time, but let's say you've got a boom out and they want you to mix. The directive is to mix, which means that you need to make sure that a proper mix is being recorded to one of your tracks. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 1. That's not very typical in documentary to be asked to do a live mix, because most of the time in post-production in documentary they're going to remix it, right? And in narrative too they're going to remix it, but the ask will come in more often on narrative to provide a real-time mix. Also, in a completely unrelated type of shooting, like if you're doing live, like I've done live TV a couple times. Now, live TV is a mixing environment, 100%. You better provide a final mix. There's no tracking there, okay? So, mixing versus tracking. I'm going to do a little bit more of a detailed video on that, but tend to do more tracking in documentary, tend to do more mixing in narrative. Not a hard and fast rule, but it's a tendency, okay? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about structure. A good project of any kind, a good narrative or documentary project, should have structure, okay? Like, we want structure. Structure makes productions go better, all right? It just does. When everybody knows what's happening before it happens, usually you have better results. I'm just going to say that in general, documentaries tend to be less structured than narratives, okay? I have been on plenty of narratives that lacked all semblance of structure. I've been on those where it felt like a mess, okay? I've also been on documentaries that felt like a complete mess. I'm not saying that both types can't be a mess. I'm saying, though, that narratives have more structure in general. Even a very structured documentary is going to be less structured. How does that impact the sound person? Well, that impacts the sound person because you need to be the utmost flexible person when doing documentary, okay? Documentary is not the time for you to throw an attitude out. Documentary is not the time when the director comes to you and they're like, hey, can we have like a microphone on Bob? And Bob was never in the list or whatever, and they're like, yeah, can we put a mic on Bob? Like, that is not the time for you to throw an attitude, all right? That is the time for you to be like, yeah, let's put a mic on Bob. It doesn't matter that Bob wasn't on the list. It doesn't matter. He showed up and the director wants to put a mic on them. It's fine. That's less likely to happen in a narrative setting. On documentary, you really work out that flexibility muscle a lot more than you do on narrative, because things just happen, okay? And especially when you're out there recording like a cinema verite style documentary, the whole point of a cinema verite style documentary is to go follow something and you don't know what's going to happen. So how could you know what's going to happen? Because you don't. You just got to be prepared. You got to think through your coverage. You got to think through who needs mics. You got to think where your boom needs to be. Your boom needs to be probably not where the lavs are on a documentary. So if you've got 3 people laved up and they're off having a conversation, then a 4th or 5th person comes in, on the documentary, your boom is going to those extra people that don't have mics. You follow what I'm saying? On a narrative, after you see the blocking, you should know what's happening, and there shouldn't really need to be any really really crazy flexing and changing of the way that you're doing it in the middle, right? Like, it just shouldn't be that way. Sometimes it is, but like, it really shouldn't be that way, because you should see the blocking, you should see what the actors are doing, you should decide on your mic positions, and then you have a chance to shoot it. Documentary stuff, well, you just need to be ready, right? Ready for what's going to happen. The reason I wanted to talk about this topic is because it just occurred to me the other day that there is a completely different mindset for doing it. I personally have done considerably more documentary audio. We're talking like a lot. So my documentary audio is considerably more common than my narrative audio. And I have to make sure that when I go into a narrative setting that I'm remembering some of these aspects that aren't the case with documentary. Because sometimes I get in the documentary world and I'm using the techniques and the skills and the muscle memory that I have for documentary, and then I get into a narrative setting and it's a switch I have to flip, okay? So I hope this helps. I hope this helps you understand a little bit about the differences. A lot of the gear transfers, but some of it doesn't. Like that Slate, I'm telling you, Slate is so much more common on a narrative. Higher wireless count, for me, in my experience, has been more common on documentary. It may be different for other people, but my experience has been that I need more wireless for documentary than I do for narrative. I still need a high quality boom pole for both. I still need to be paying attention and understanding the task at hand. Am I tracking or am I mixing? Very important. But stay with it. If you're looking at getting into sound, it is a lot of fun, all right? But it does require buying a lot of equipment, and you need to buy it over time. So don't get discouraged if you don't have all the stuff you need right away. If you keep booking work, it'll come. The projects will come. You'll add more gear, slowly but surely, and then over time, you'll have a pretty impressive package. That's what happened to me. So over time, I just started buying gear, and then before you know it, I've got a whole set of gear that I can go out and do amazing things with, okay? But you can do amazing things with simple gear. Okay? You can. I'm a testament to that. When I've been producing these YouTube videos, I don't even bring my sound bag. Okay? I just have a microphone right here. Okay? I have a Tentacle Sync Track E right here on my waist, and I'm recording into a very simple GoPro. So don't convince yourself that you have to have lots of expensive things in order to go out there and be successful. You do have to have a couple expensive things. So stick with it. If you're on this freelance journey, keep going, keep networking, keep working. And as they say, you're only as good as your last day that you worked. We'll see you in the next one.